Have you ever experienced those moments when you feel a chill from an unfamiliar sound in the dark but can't explain it? In today's video, I'll tell you a mysterious and haunting story from the remote countryside of Scotland. A story that will make your heart race as a man encounters something unbelievable right at his doorstep. Join me as we uncover the truth behind those mysterious sounds and what really happened in the dead of night. So this happened about 3 months back. It stuck with me, and I just want to get the whole story off my chest, to be honest. I live in a rural area in the northwest coast of Scotland. The scenery is beautiful, with lochs and bens, lakes and hills for the non-Scots, right outside my door. The nearest village is about a 15-minute drive away and only has a few hundred people itself. Other than that, there are a few other houses sparsely dotted about, but the closest neighbor is still a mile or two away from me. My house is next to the loch, which I'll fish in from time to time, and a large field which acts as my backyard. The field is then abruptly met with a tree line, which is the entrance to one of the largest wooded areas in Scotland. That's more or less the layout of the gaff. Other than that, it's just me living there. My other half passed away a few years ago, and since I fell into a bit of a depression, it was a tough time in my life, but I got through it, especially after I adopted the wee man, Alfie. Alfie's a border terrier and acts as my best pal. He goes everywhere with me and has really been the difference between life and death at times. Because we're so isolated up here, the usual routine is just before bed, about 9 or 10 p.m., I'll open the back door for Alfie to run around the field for a bit. Get out any last-minute shites or pisses? It's Scotland, so naturally 360 days of the year are freezing. Because of this, I'll shut the door behind him and wait for him to come and scratch the door after to let him in. So this one night, 24th through April this year, things were as normal. I was sat watching some rubbish on Netflix, Alfie next to me. The wee man got up and started stretching, so I made a mental note to go and let him out. I finished watching whatever I was watching and went and opened the back door. The night was, of course, pitch black, and I could just see the outline of the trees in the tree line. I lit up a quick cigarette, bad habit I know, and smoked it quickly before closing the door. I went and did some bits and bobs, closing curtains and doing some dishes, when I heard Alfie scratching away at the door. It had been about 5 or 10 minutes, so I went to go and let him in again. I put the plate I was cleaning down and began walking down the corridor to the back door. I yawned on the way and gave Alfie a rub on the head as I walked past. I thought about having another cigarette, but I gave Alfie a rub on the head. The thought stopped me dead in my tracks. I turned back, and sure enough, Alfie was lying snoozing in the corridor. Weird. I could have sworn I heard him scratching on the door. He must not have gone out when I opened the door, and then I imagined the scratching. I turned around again to head back the way I came, and chills ran down my spine. I heard the scratching again. Now I knew for a fact it wasn't Alfie. He was lying right next to me. I also knew for a fact I hadn't imagined it. I waited a few more seconds and the scratching persisted. I instantly felt my heart drop to my stomach. I felt queasy. What the fuck was scratching at my door? I decided to go upstairs to my bedroom because I knew I could get a view of the back door and what was at it from that window. I cautiously crept up the stairs and then slowly pulled the curtains back just enough to peek through. I promise on my late Eileen's grave, this next bit is completely true. I watched in horror as a fully grown man who was perched on all fours began to scratch at my back door again. This sight nearly made me faint. I'm not a small man, and I chop and deliver firewood for a living, so I'm pretty strong. But just pure creepiness of seeing this shook me to my core. I couldn't see his face that well, but I could make out he was maybe 30, 40 years old and was maybe of Western Asian descent. with brown skin and a scraggly black beard. A point that may be relevant is that my particular area of Scotland is very white, about 99% I think, and everyone knows each other anyway. No one even knows someone of that description in any of the local villages, within 40 or 50 miles. I also could make out a grin on the man's face. It looked like he was trying to stifle it, however, like he was excited but was trying to keep himself composed. The scratch noises were indistinguishable from Alfie's, so I immediately knew he must have had long fingernails. He scratched the door a couple more times over the next minute or so. After this, he crawled down the 3 or 4 stairs back to the back garden and began crawling in circles. This image was even more sickening than the last. A grown man crawling on the floor like a dog. What the actual fuck? That was until he burst out into a sprint. He had quickly risen from his crawl and taken the 10-15 meters he was away as a run-up the charge straight into the back door. I fitted those doors myself, so I trusted the hinges they were built on, and rightly so. The man bounced right off the door, but the sound immediately alerted Alfie. Alfie started barking uncontrollably, and I took this as a chance to say something too. "Get the fuck out of here, mate. I can fucking see ya," I shouted down. The man didn't even flinch. He just stood up from the floor and brushed himself off. He didn't even look up at me. He then just turned around and walked calmly further into the backyard. Further and further until he hit the tree line and still kept walking. The guy had only been wearing a hoodie and dark gray tracksuit bottoms, so he must have been freezing. To then venture off into the dark woods, alone, so carelessly. The whole situation had me equally as confused as it did terrified. I called the local village's police station. They said they'd sent someone out to talk to me. When the officer got here, I told him the story and recounted the man to the best of my abilities. But after I finished recounting the tale, all I got was a, "Are you drinking again, Derek?" I couldn't believe it. I had had a wee bit of an issue a few years back after Eileen, but put the booze down and been sober for the last 12 months. He clearly just didn't believe me. Fuck, didn't know if I'd believe me either, to be honest. He left and it was just me and Alfie again. Neither of us slept a wink the rest of the night. I also broke my sobriety for the first time that night, which is not something I'm proud of. And that was that. Didn't hear anything about a body in the woods. Didn't hear anything about a man of that description. Didn't hear anything about the same thing happening to the neighbors. I couldn't believe it. The more I went over it in my head, the more it began to terrify me. That man must have been watching me and noticed my habit of letting Alfie in when he scratched the door, for however many nights before he tried it himself. Was just lucky Alf decided not to go out that night. The part that really terrifies me is that he never knew I was watching him. So when he crawled down and kept his acting like a dog act facade going, that was just for him. He was acting like that, thinking no one was watching. I've spent the past months combing over all the pictures of any escaped mental patients or convicts over the last 20 years, but nothing. It's almost as if the guy, I hear the fucking scratching again. I hear the fucking scratching at my door again, and Alfie is at my feet. It sounds slower this time and deeper into the wood of the door. I'm gonna go and confront this bastard. Fuck it. Wish me luck. I'll update when it's over. The story of the mysterious scratching at the door in the dark Scottish countryside is not just a terrifying experience, but also a reminder of vigilance and isolation. The image of a grown man acting like a beast in the dark is one of the most striking details, making the story unforgettable and deeply haunting. Personally, I feel the dread and confusion the storyteller must have gone through, and this story will surely haunt me for many nights to come. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more mysterious tales, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Leave a comment with your thoughts and share any strange stories you've experienced. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Imagine this. A young kid, just 6 years old, suddenly wakes up in the middle of the night, deep in the woods. Scary, right? This story takes you through that terrifying night, full of fear, confusion, and some really creepy moments. Stick around to find out what happened and how it all unfolded. This is long, so I apologize for that. I've never had to tell this story with enough detail to actually explain it all the way. But it is true, and it happened when I was about 6 years old. In a quiet room, if you press your ear against a pillow, you can hear your heartbeat. As a kid, the muffled, rhythmic beats sounded like soft footsteps on a carpeted floor. And so as a kid, almost every night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I would hear these footsteps and I would be ripped back to consciousness, terrified. For my entire childhood, I lived with my mother in a fairly nice neighborhood that was in a transitional phase. People of lower economic means were gradually moving in, and my mother and I were two of these people. We lived in the kind of house you see being transported in two pieces on the interstate, but my mom took good care of it. There were a lot of woods surrounding the neighborhood that I would play in and explore during the day. But at night, as things often do to a kid, they took on a more sinister feeling. This, coupled with the fact that, due to the nature of our house, there was a fairly large crawl space underneath, filled my mind with imaginary monsters and inescapable scenarios which would consume my thoughts when I was awoken by the footsteps. I told my mom about the footsteps and she said that I was just imagining things. I persisted enough that she blasted my ears with water from a turkey baster once just to placate me, since I thought that would help. Of course it didn't. Despite all the creepiness and footsteps, the only weird thing that ever happened was that every now and then I would wake up on the bottom bunk, despite having gone to sleep on the top. But this wasn't really weird, since I'd sometimes get up to piss or get something to drink and could remember just going back to sleep on the bottom bunk. I'm an only child, so it didn't matter. This would happen once or twice a week, but waking up on the bottom bunk wasn't too terrifying. But one night I didn't wake up on the bottom bunk. I had heard the footsteps but was too far gone to be woken up by them, and when I was awoken it wasn't from the sound of footsteps or a nightmare, but because I was cold, really cold. When I opened my eyes, I saw stars. I was in the woods. I sat up immediately and tried to figure out what was going on. I thought I was dreaming, but that didn't seem right, though neither did me being in the woods. There was a deflated pool float right in front of me, one of those ones shaped like a shark. This only added to the surreal feeling, but after a while it seemed like I just wasn't going to wake up because I wasn't asleep. I stood up to orient myself, but I didn't recognize these woods. I played in the woods by my house all the time, and so I knew them really well, but if these weren't the same woods, then how could I get out? I took a step and felt a shooting pain in my foot, which knocked me back to where I had just been laying. I had stepped on a thorn. By the light of the moon, I could see that they were everywhere. I looked at my other foot, but it was fine, and as a matter of fact, so was the rest of me. I didn't have another scratch on me, and I wasn't even that dirty. I cried for a little bit and then stood back up. I didn't know which way to go, so I just picked a direction. I resisted the urge to call out, since I wasn't sure I wanted to be found by who or what might be out there. I walked for what seemed like hours. I tried to walk in a straight line and tried to course correct when I had to take detours, but I was a kid and I was afraid. There weren't any howls or screams, and only once did I hear any noise that scared me. It sounded like a crying baby. I think now that it was just a cat, but I panicked. I ran veering in different directions to avoid big thicks of bushes and collapsed trees. And I was paying close attention to where I stepped, because by that point my feet were in pretty bad shape. I paid too much attention to where I was stepping and not enough to where those steps were leading, because not long after hearing the cry, I saw something that filled me with a kind of despair I haven't experienced since. It was the pool float. I was only 10 feet from where I had woken up. This wasn't magic or some supernatural space bending. I was lost. Up until that moment, I thought more about getting out of the woods than how I got in, but being back at the beginning caused my mind to swim. I wasn't even sure that these were my woods. I had only been hoping that they were. Had I run in a huge circle around that spot, or did I just get turned around and start making my way back? How was I going to get out? At the time, I thought the North Star was just the brightest star, and so I looked and found the brightest one and followed it. Eventually, things started to look more familiar, and when I saw the ditch, a dirt ditch my friends and I would have dirt-clawed wars in, I knew I had made it out. By that point, I was walking really slowly because my feet hurt so much. But I was so happy to be so close to home that I broke into a light jog. When I actually saw the roof of my house over a neighboring, lower-set house, I let out a light sob and ran faster. I just wanted to be home. I had already decided that I wouldn't say anything because I had no idea what I could possibly say. I would get back in the house somehow, clean up, and get in bed. My heart sunk as I rounded the corner and my house came fully into view. Every light in the house was on. I knew my mom was up, and I knew I would have to explain, or try to explain, where I had been, and I couldn't even figure out where to start. My run became a jog, which became a walk. I saw her silhouette through the blinds, and although I was worried about how to explain things to her, that didn't matter to me at that point. I walked up the couple of steps to the porch and put my hand on the doorknob and turned. Right before I pushed it open, two arms wrapped around me and pulled me back. I screamed as loud as I could, "Mom, help me! Please, Mom!" The feeling of being so close to being safe and then being physically pulled away from it filled me with a kind of dread that is, even after all these years, indescribable. The door I had been torn away from opened, and a flash of hope shot through my heart. But it wasn't my mom. It was a man, and he was enormous. I thrashed around and kicked at the shins of the person holding me, while also trying to get away from the person who had just come out of my house. I was scared, but I was furious. "Let me go! Where is she? Where's my mom? What did you do to her?" As my throat stung from screaming and I was drawing in another breath, I became aware of a sound that had been present for longer than I had perceived it. "Honey, please calm down. I've got you." It sounded like my mom. The arms loosened and set me down, and as man approaching me blocked out the porch light, with his head I noticed his clothes. He was a cop. I turned to face the voice behind me and saw that it really was my mom. Everything was okay. I began to cry, and the three of us went inside. "I'm so glad you're home, sweetie. I was worried I'd never see you again." By that point, she was crying too. "I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. I just wanted to come home. I'm sorry." "It's okay, just don't ever do that again. I'm not sure me or my shins could take it." A little laughter broke through my sobs, and I smiled a bit. "Well, I'm sorry for kicking you, but why'd you have to grab me like that?" "I was just afraid that you'd run away again." I was confused. "What do you mean?" "We found your note on your pillow," she said, and pointed at the piece of paper that the police officer was sliding across the table. I picked up the note and read it. It was a running away letter. It said that I was unhappy, never wanted to see her or any of my friends again. The police officer exchanged a few words with my mom on the porch while I stared at the letter. I didn't remember writing a letter. I didn't remember anything about any of this. But even if I sometimes went to the bathroom at night and didn't remember, or even if I could have gone into the woods on my own, even if all that could have been true, the only thing I knew at that point was, this isn't how you spell my name. I didn't write this letter. Thinking back on that night, it's clear how frightening and confusing it was. A little kid lost in the woods, the spooky discovery of a letter with a misspelled name. These details make the whole experience even more chilling. If this story grabbed your attention, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your own creepy experiences in the comments and keep an eye out for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thanks for watching, and remember, the scariest things often come when you least expect them. Have you ever wondered what it's like to work behind the scenes at Disney, where the magic never stops? Well, I've got a story that will take you deep into the heart of one of their most iconic attractions, but with a twist that's as unsettling as it is intriguing. Imagine being hired to care for dolls that aren't quite what they seem, in a place where the lines between fantasy and reality blur. This isn't your typical Disney fairy tale. Prepare yourself for something much darker lurking within the happiest place on earth. Now I'm unsure where I stand legally with this after signing an NDA, but those things only matter if you're alive, right? My name is Mac Haberstroh. The Mac is short for Mackenzie, and I'm a freelance artist. Now, I'm not a painter. In fact, my work revolves around dolls. I'm not fond of them as much as the next person. In fact, porcelain dolls scare me the most. Their lifeless eyes in dire fashion are outdated, and I can't help but associate them with horror movies. I often avoid working with them unless I'm desperate for a gig, but I must admit that doing their hair is more manageable than most dolls. Despite this, I spend most of my time working on anything but porcelain. I post my work on Facebook and Instagram, as they have been the best way to reach clients, but when my niece Laura suggested I try and upload clips to TikTok, I saw an influx of interest in my handiwork. I was surprised to see how many people sat through a quick 1-minute clip of hair restoration or styling, and despite the negative stigma surrounding dolls, people loved it. Kids seemed to enjoy my guides, and I was thankful. In fact, Laura's suggestion was so helpful that I received a message requesting my phone number from the Disney in my business email, despite the address only being linked to my Facebook and Instagram. At 10:34 p.m. the following evening, I received a call. I was tempted to ignore the obnoxious buzzing from my mobile due to how late it was. My social battery was drained from a day of putting on a personality for videos, and I had just selected a movie to watch. But when I answered, the mention of a hefty sum of money soon sent electricity through my veins, and I was awoken by the sheer motivator of cold, hard cash. Before I tell you about the job, I have to explain it a little. If you're not familiar with yarn, weirdly enough, it grows. Technically, it stretches over time, but when you put it on a doll, you may as well say it grows. And with the added wetness and humidity of places such as the Disney It's a Small World ride, the doll's hair booms. Since yarn has a very high chance of splitting, you can't just hire anybody to cut the hair. It needs to be somebody with experience, as it means they'd have to pay another person to come and replant more. This is where I come in. When you download or sign up for something, do you read the terms and services? Because I don't. I probably should have read my contract past the first page and maybe the NDA when I arrived in California. Over the phone, Mr. Darwin mentioned that I was allowed to take pictures for my portfolio. However, I was not allowed to live stream the process on Facebook or Instagram. Any knowledge of the workings of Disney was not allowed to be shared. Nothing surrounding live streaming on TikTok was mentioned verbally, but I wonder if the NDA had any information that may have warned me about the experience. After the brief meeting, a senior cast member named Louise led me to where I would be staying, which from my understanding was situated right in the park. Louise was pretty young, perhaps mid-20s, a year older than me. However, despite her young age, dark circles hidden poorly by makeup hung from her eyes, and her mousy blonde hair was thin and frail and hung in her face. She walked me around the park and showed me employee walls awarding long-serving cast members. A few awards belonged to Mr. Darwin, who worked for the park for over 15 years. So you like dolls? Louise asked timidly, as if she had forgotten her role for a minute. You could say that, but I mainly like doing their hair. I've always enjoyed it, even when I was little. I shrugged. The girls in your family must love you. She smiled softly. Soon enough, she closed the distance between us. I grew up with my dad, and he didn't know how to tie hair. She sighed, her voice hardly audible over both adults' and children's joyous screams. What about your mom or sisters? I asked, afraid to overstep any boundaries. My mom passed away while I was super little. My dad's side of the family didn't really have many female relatives. I gave Louise a small smile, unsure what to say, and ultimately decided to change the topic. Who previously did the doll's hair? I asked just as Louise showed me how to open my room door. I thought that a place like Disney would have a permanent guy for it. The question must have surprised her because she fumbled with my card and a red light flickered above the handle. Never met her. Her need to avoid eye contact made it very obvious she was lying. I found it peculiar that Disney didn't have a specific person for the role. I asked Mr. Darwin on the phone when he first called, but he just told me she transferred to the treasured staff department, but I was hoping to speak to her about how the dolls are usually treated. Louise tried the sensor again, and this time we were greeted by the clink of a door unlocking and a green light. You should try asking him then. I didn't speak to her much. Is there anything else you need? She asked, and I shook my head no. The room was like a studio apartment, open planned with the only walled-off area being the bathroom. It was cozy, and a kitchen meant I could cook rather than fattening myself up on expensive attraction food. Sat on the kitchen island was an elegant but aged file on all of the dolls and a small toolbox. Every single page had been laminated, but it was clear they were once left bare by the crinkles on each sheet. There was one page specifically that was aged the most and stained with purple-brown ink. The picture attached to the document seemed to have been taped on, while the others must have been glued. The image was a pretty blonde doll dressed in aged attire with a small white apron. The sheet listed her usual hair length and sign-off sheets for when the hair had been cut and replaced, but unlike the other dolls, Belladonna had managed to keep her original yarn from 2005. Despite not being the oldest of dolls, her page had definitely been loved. In the toolkit were scissors, tonics, and cotton buds to care for the dolls. Although the hair was my forte, they requested I also clean the dolls' eyes and any dirt spots or mold that may have gathered since their last time of care. Mr. Darwin requests that you enjoy your free time until this evening when the park is closed. Louise smiled. We like to keep our rides operable during the day and avoid disturbing the magic for the guests while on the ride. The last thing they'd want to see is you working on the dolls. I'll be back to guide you this evening. And with that, she left. With Louise gone, I took the time to study each doll. Almost all of them had the same care pattern, and honestly, trimming yarn was something I'd done for decades. A few dolls with sticky notes on their pages needed particular things such as restyling. These dolls moved a lot more, and their hair often came loose, and a few had needed more hair planted in. When evening came, Louise guided me over to the ride. The incredibly catchy tune still played and got louder as we approached. She took me through the back entrance, which allowed me to access the dolls from the back. Louise, I called just as she was leaving. Could you turn the music off? I asked, surprised that they went through the effort of emptying the water, but left the music running. I can't, she said flatly. Is there not a button? I can help you look. I don't know if I can work while it's playing. I insisted. I also wasn't sure if I'd get some sort of copyright issue on TikTok. No, we've never turned the music off. It messes with the dolls. There was a slight pause. Mechanics. I'm not sure about the specifics, but many are old animatronics, and the music plays a big part. But if you need to pause a doll while you work on it, you just need to press their IMB's individual mechanism buttons. There was nothing too strange about the first evening. I had never been to Disneyland before, so I was completely unaware that the song's language had changed for each area. I managed to get just over a dozen of the dolls preened and cleaned, meaning that I could move from the frozen North Pole section to Scandinavia. The few people that joined my stream enjoyed the process, and with my phone on a tripod, I was able to work efficiently. As expected, a majority of viewers had complained about the song, so much so that I had to pin a comment explaining that I couldn't turn it off. A strange thing was that some of the dolls had a weird goo at the top of their head, as some sort of brownish bonding agent hadn't mixed well with the humidity. I scanned the Scandinavian section for a moment and took in the details. From beautiful and traditional dresses to unique hats, it looked magical. I could tell which dolls had a lot of movement from the number of flyaway hairs. However, there was one doll that didn't remain static. In the distance, on top of a crescent moon in the air, sat 3 dolls. In the center, a blonde doll's head moved right to left on a loop, as if surveying the area. I had attempted to show the viewers, but I caught a looming Louise standing at the door to the section. "Ms. Haberstroh?" Louise called out. She was no longer in her uniform, but her hair was still neatly tied back. She remained at the door to the attraction, almost like she refused to come in. I didn't blame her, though. One misstep, and you'd probably fall. I pulled my phone down and looked toward Louise. I swallowed a flat glob of spit back down to my throat and replied with a strained, "Sorry to disturb you, but it's 3 a.m. I was told I had to guide you back to your room before I could clock out." She yawned. I gathered my gear in a rush, careful not to knock over anything in the set. Had she noticed? "No, Louise, I'm sorry. Let's go." The next night I came prepared with earbuds designed for married couples to drown out their partner's snores, but nothing could cancel out the cheery song. They were so useless that I ripped them at the beginning. The earbuds were better used as an expensive cotton swab, great for those hard-to-hit spots. Once again, Louise watched me from the door for a few moments. "How many nights do you think it'll take you?" she asked curiously. With this many dolls? It could be 2 weeks, maybe more." I shrugged. I used the dull pair of scissors to snip away the elastic band around a doll's hair. Louise allowed the tune to fill the silence for a couple of seconds before saying goodbye and leaving. I once again set up my phone. If the CIA wanted a new torture method, boy, do I have one for them. The tune to "It's a Small World" is endearing for a short while, but it becomes increasingly annoying. Imagine just how much I wanted to rip my hair out after an hour. I was surprised that my viewers continued to increase. I talked through another doll and changed the angle to show the 3 dolls on the moon again. However, I was surprised to see the center one sat static again. "That's strange," I hummed. "Perhaps she needs repairs. I think it's one of the older dolls. She's pretty, though." I moved the phone to point to other dolls and began work on another that needed a trim. Something as simple as a snip takes a lot of time, as you need to be careful. I'll have to ask for a ladder tomorrow. Maybe we will get a good view from up there. Nearing the night's end, I noticed the dull pair of scissors had gone missing. I had come across them on the track with some extreme looking and a brilliant suggestion to use a torch. Embarrassed by my mistake and the idea that I may have dropped them while the earbuds were in, I grew extremely flushed. "You can't record in here, Mackenzie," Louise spluttered in a panic. I almost dropped the scissors at her voice. "You can take pictures, but you need to delete that video." Although it was a demand, it seemed like she was regurgitating someone else's words, and like a child being scolded, I stuttered to speak. "It's a live stream. End it. End it now." She was desperate. I quickly followed her word and closed the live. "Is it off?" I nodded. "You can't do that. They're shy." Louise glanced up at the moon, and her eyes changed for a split second before she let out a small chuckle, indicating that she was joking. "Hey, you head back. I need to close up." She smiled, and I obliged. "Don't worry, I won't tell them." Disney probably safety checked the ride each morning, but I couldn't help but think of the scissors causing a crash or flinging into somebody's face. The fact that I could have killed somebody kept me up alongside the mass messages of an edited screenshot of the Moondolls. The most annoying part was that it was sent from many accounts. A stupid joke, but one freaky enough to make me not want to be in there alone. On further inspection, the middle doll had been staring at the camera, something its mechanism shouldn't have allowed it to do. I managed to sleep through the day. The warm sun illuminated the room softly and protected me from anything looming in the shadows, and allowed my overreactive brain to relax. I had managed to wash up, feed myself, and play on my phone for a bit until there was a knock at my door. "Ms. Haberstroh, I'm here to escort you." A male voice trickled in from the cracks beneath the door. I hesitated to answer and crept to the door. "Where's Louise?" I asked. "She transferred to a different department," he informed, and I peeped through the spy hole. In front of the door was a young gentleman in his early 20s. Despite his age, he seemed confident in himself. It was weird since she didn't mention transferring. Maybe she forgot. "Mr. Darwin asked me to escort you from now on." He beamed as if he knew I was looking at him, so I opened the door and he handed me the doll profile book. "You left this last night." The walk to the ride felt shorter than ever. Michael and I got along swimmingly, and he shared stories of his little sister's fascination with dolls, which he had gotten from their older sister. I was wrong to be suspicious of him. "Hey, Michael, do you know how to turn the music off?" I tried. "Oh, it doesn't turn off. The dolls have to stay active, which means the music stays on," he informed. The reply was similar to Louise's. I decided not to work on the Moondolls that session as the middle one had disappeared, maybe for repairs. Pushing my luck, I set up another stream and started by showing the new section to the viewers. "Strange. None of them are moving today." I noticed. It was true. The music was playing. However, the dolls were still, as if their IMBs had been pressed. I guess it makes it easier for me to work on them. Since it was an easier night, I was able to answer a few questions. I refused to disclose the location, but people quickly identified the dolls. "How do you know which is which?" a comment asked. "Well, if you check their backs, there is a tag with a number on the back," I explained while moving to the next doll. I arrived at one which looked well kept and searched for the tag. "Oh, this one doesn't have one." I showed the front of the doll to the camera. Her mousy blonde hair hung straight, but the strange brown goo had begun to seep from the scalp. She must have lost her tag. I took the time to clear the smelly goop and tied the hair back, careful not to ruin the yarn. Just as I was about to switch to another doll, I noticed the liquid had started to seep out of one of her eyes. I quickly wiped it with a cloth, turning the material a maroon color. Maybe it's some sort of wood glue or something. I swapped to another doll which was dressed up as Alice from Alice in Wonderland and pulled out the tag to show it. Number 32. So if I search through my book for 32, it'll show me a reference. I grinned. I can't show you though, or I'll get into trouble. But I bet you can guess who she's meant to look like. I learned from previous mistakes and stopped my stream before 3. Which was good judgment because Michael appeared right on time. "How's it going?" He smiled. "Peachy. I found one without a tag though." "Who do I report it to?" I pointed out the doll to him. "Oh, I'll look into it." Belladonna was back the next night and the dolls were back in motion. It seemed the further along I got, the lazier the dolls became. I couldn't help but wonder if the mechanics got burnt out after being on 24/7. Michael was able to get me a ladder, but he seemed to linger around, meaning I couldn't stream. I climbed up the ladder and placed my toolbox at the top. There was no room for the book, so it meant I had to climb back down to double-check my work. "Did you find out what number the doll was?" I tied its hair back, but I'm worried it had a certain style, I asked him. taking extra care to trim the yarn of the first doll while so high up. Michael hummed, "I'm not sure. Do you want to come and check with me? I know where the ride plans are," he mentioned. "Like right now?" With my rising viewage, I didn't want to start my stream too late. It felt like I had people expecting me for once. "When you're done with that." I took a look at Belladonna and pressed her IMB. Something clicked, and it allowed her head to move back and forth again. Although I hadn't worked on her yet, I didn't want to jam the mechanics for too long for fear of breaking her. Michael took me to a backroom area for the ride, somewhere I'd never expected to be. He rummaged around as if he knew what he should be looking for, but not where it was. I heard that they keep an updated plan from the Imagineers somewhere. Every other ride I've worked on had one. They're usually updated when there are any changes. He shuffled around until he got to the last drawer. "Oh? What is it?" "This one was last updated in 2006. Disappointment alongside something else I couldn't pinpoint coated his voice. I watched as he took out the previous plan and waited for him to examine them. "Ms. Haberstroh, what do you think about the ride?" he asked. "I mean, it's cute. I struggled to place an opinion on it. Kinda strange. I don't know. My older sister used to love this ride. When she turned 18, I remember she got a Disney pass so she could come and look at all the dolls. I raised a brow, feeling like I was in the wrong place. I was only like 8 at the time. "Yeah," I replied. "Let's head back. A lot of the dolls aren't even on here, especially the new one. Did you check down the shirt for the tag?" "No, I guess I didn't check properly." For some reason, Michael kept hold of the ride plan and followed me out. We navigated towards the mystery doll across the ride, and I noticed a new tag hanging out of its shirt. Just as I went to reach it, a huge crash echoed throughout the tunnel. The sound of clashing metal sent both Michael and me jumping out of our skin. Michael screamed a few curse words and quickly corrected himself. It seemed like he hadn't fully grasped the cast member personality just yet. "Sorry," he apologized. We turned the slight corner together to see my toolbox on the ground. The ladder, however, was still in place. I guess I should be the one that's sorry. I should have taken it down with me. Unfortunately, bottles of cleaners and tonic had smashed across the track. I hopped down and tried to clear the bigger pieces while Michael grabbed a broom. I loaded the bigger chunks onto the now liquid-soaked piece of cloth, but a much smaller piece impaled my finger in the process. It didn't cause much harm, but I was a baby about pulling it out. When Michael came back, he helped me remove it, and I used the cloth to stop the bleeding while he retrieved the first aid kit. The liquid on the fabric stung and turned my blood a dark color. It wasn't one of my best ideas to use something soaked in cleaning fluid as a gauze. When Michael came back, he took it upon himself to disinfect and bandage the wound. Despite everything, I was stuck staring at the cloth. Michael followed my gaze to the cloth and hissed under his breath, "You lost all of that blood?" "No, just a bit. Those big stains are from the dolls," I huffed. "Why would dolls bleed?" he asked, confused. "I mean, I'm not a doll expert, but it wasn't blood. It was a weird goop. It may have been glue or something reacting with the rusty mechanisms." Now that I had said it aloud, it did sound stupid. "Which doll?" he asked. "Quite a few. The one we were at had some." Michael grabbed the scissors off the ground and rushed over to the newly tagged doll. I scrambled behind him, desperate to keep up. "What did she look like?" He shook. "She? She. The person before me. Louise." Michael rushed his words out. His panic had started to infect me. She had almost brown hair, mousy blonde, dark circles. I don't know." I tripped over my words. "Look at it." Although his voice was weak, his sentence was demanding, and I did as I was told. At first, it didn't make sense. The doll in front of me was frail-looking, skinny with less yarn than they give the rest. Sure, the hair color was the same, But that didn't mean anything. "You're not suggesting—" I trailed off. It was so ridiculous that I couldn't finish my sentence. "Cleaning fluid has formaldehyde in it. Do you know what it's also used for?" he asked. Scissors gripped so hard in his hands that his fingers were turning white. When I failed to answer, he did it for me. "They embalm with it. It reacts with blood too. It's even used in disinfection wipes." I had caught on to part of his accusation even more now. "But if it was embalmed, why would it leak?" "I don't know. A shitty job, maybe?" Michael raised the scissors, ready to stab into the doll, and I threw myself in front of him. "Stop! This is stupid! You can't destroy it! You have no proof!" Michael stopped, lowered his arms, and paused for a minute. He pulled the folded ride plan out of his pocket and opened it up. "Do you remember which dolls had the goo? Circle them." I stared at the plan for longer than I wanted. It took me a few moments to decipher it. "Well, I can't," I admitted. "They're not on there. Only the moon one is." "Show me the page for it." Michael followed me back to the doll portfolio. It was already open on Belladonna's, ready for her fix-up. "Hers." I handed him the book, which he took. I watched as a tan Michael turned pale as a sheet. His appearance became incredibly sickly, and his lack of reaction worried me. Finally, he shook out a breath and swallowed. He shakily handed me back the book and sat on the wet track. Michael began to sob into his knees aggressively, and once again, I stood in fright of the strange man. It wasn't until I crouched down to his height to comfort him that I managed to hear what he was crying out. "Donna! Donna! Donna!" he sobbed. His voice cracked, and his words broke from his tears. "Donna? Belladonna?" I asked, and he only sobbed harder. I couldn't get an explanation out of him for a long time. We sat on the tracks, soaking our trousers in leftover chlorine residue. I had no idea how to deal with somebody so unbelievably upset that all I could do was take the scissors off of him, drop them, and wait. When he finally calmed down, he glanced up at the doll on the moon, returning the stare. Pinpricks of fear stabbed my body as I locked eyes with her, but she didn't move. "My sister, Donna, she went missing here. My parents never told me what happened, but I became obsessed with her disappearance a few years back. The police never figured it out, and she apparently checked out of the park, so it wasn't the park's responsibility." I felt uncomfortable but heard him out. "They think they found her body, but her face was mangled. Her eyes, teeth, and fingertips were missing, but it had her bracelet. My parents couldn't confirm it was her, but we buried it anyway." I wrapped my arm around him and pulled him into an embrace, his wet cheeks pressed against mine. "Belladonna is what a cast member used to call her. I rewatched old home videos recently. He wasn't too old. He maybe had a few years on her. Probably was my age. Pretty Donna." I watched Michael stand up and head to the ladders. His shaky frame climbed it towards the doll. I didn't have the heart to stop him. He ripped it from its frame and carried it down. Brown goo leaked from its eyes, but it remained completely static. "Mom and Dad always said you'd go after anyone who gave you attention. You were born to be adored," he whispered and wiped her eyes with his sleeve. In an unexpected feat, Michael, who had grabbed the scissors off the floor, stabbed the doll's face. Brown sludge dripped from the hole, and whitish stones fell to the ground alongside it. Teeth. All around us, the dolls began to leak, their bodies motionless, and the music stopped. This was her favorite ride. He sobbed and embraced the doll, staining his uniform with the liquid. I watched as he mourned for a long time. The relief of finding out what happened to his sister, but the pain of losing her again, had reopened wounds that had once healed. Michael and I both left in my car. However, my phone won't stop ringing. I have blocked Mr. Darwin's phone number, but I keep getting calls from random and unknown numbers. Michael told me not to answer. I was hired by Disney to cut the hair of the It's a Small World dolls because their hair grows yearly, and now I fear that my life is in danger. And just like that, what began as a simple job turned into an experience that I'll never forget. The details of this story, from the eerie music that never stops to the dolls that seem almost alive, leave an unsettling imprint that lingers long after you've heard it. One thing is for sure, Disney may be magical, but every bit of magic has its shadow. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more spine-chilling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Who knows, maybe next time, the story could be about something or someone you've always found too unsettling to talk about. On a stifling August afternoon, when the heat of summer made the air heavy and unusually quiet, Harry received an unexpected call from Jerry, a childhood friend he hadn't seen in years. The call pulled him back to memories he had tried to bury, memories of a mysterious event that happened when they were just kids. Curiosity mixed with fear in his heart as Harry decided to meet Jerry, and the story of apartment number 12, a sealed and haunted apartment, began to resurface in his mind. It was a stifling August day, the air heavy with the thick scent of summer. The sun hung high, casting long shadows across the streets as I made my way back from work. The city was eerily quiet, almost as if everyone had taken refuge from the oppressive heat. I pushed open the door to my third-floor apartment, the same old building I'd called home since I was a child. Inside, the air was cool, thanks to the thick walls that kept the heat at bay. I tossed my bag onto the couch, switched on the fan, and let out a sigh as it began to hum softly, offering some relief from the muggy air. Just as I settled down, the phone rang. Jerry's name flashed on the screen. Jerry, my childhood friend, whom I hadn't spoken to in years. I picked up instinctively. "Hello." My voice was tinged with uncertainty, wondering what had driven him to call me after all this time. "Hey, Harry, it's Jerry. It's been a while." His voice carried a strange tone, something that made my heart skip a beat. "Jerry, is something wrong?" I asked, trying to mask my surprise. "This isn't a conversation for the phone. Can we meet?" We agreed to meet at my apartment at 10:45 p.m. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and red, I heard a knock at the door. It was Jerry. He looked different from the last time I saw him, paler, with a strange unease in his movements. I let him in, and we sat at the table. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "Harry, I need to tell you something. Something that's been haunting me since that time," he started, his voice quivering. "Do you remember the rules of apartment number 12? A chill ran down my spine, and my heart began to race. Jerry's words brought back memories from our childhood, memories I had tried to bury. We were just 14 when it happened. Jerry lived on the ground floor, where the bricked-up apartment number 12 was located, right at the end of a long corridor. There were no other apartments nearby. Number 11 was further up the hall, and number 13 was only on the next floor. Above the bricked-up apartment, there was nothing, just an empty space. My parents had always forbidden me from going near that apartment, and I never understood why until that day. It was an evening like no other. The sky darkened faster than usual, with storm clouds gathering ominously on the horizon. The air was thick with tension. Thunder rumbled in the distance, signaling an approaching storm. I was supposed to spend the night at Jerry's place, who lived 2 floors below in the small residential block. I headed for the stairs. As I descended, I noticed a figure standing at the bottom. Curious, I continued down the stairs. That's when I saw him for the first time, a man smoking a cigarette. I quickly passed him, not daring to look too closely. But as I did, something compelled me to glance back. He was standing there, staring at me with hollow eyes, his face pale and gaunt. After a moment, he started moving toward me. My heart raced and I quickened my pace, but he merely passed by, heading straight for the door marked number 12. I watched in disbelief as he approached the bricked-up door. Then, something happened that I can never forget. The man reached for the handle, and the concrete wall simply vanished as if it had never been there. He walked inside, closing the door behind him without a sound. Moments later, Jerry opened the door to his apartment and invited me in. I didn't tell him right away what I had just witnessed. It wasn't until we were alone in his room that I recounted the eerie encounter with the mysterious man. Jerry, rather than being skeptical, was thrilled. He suggested we go back the next day to investigate. We agreed on 3 p.m. The next morning, after a quick breakfast, I left Jerry's apartment. My mind filled with thoughts of the man in the bricked-up apartment. As the clock neared 3 p.m., my anxiety grew. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, Jerry was already waiting. We cautiously approached the door to apartment number 12. Jerry reached for the handle, but all we found was a solid concrete wall. The apartment was bricked up, just as it had always been. Jerry, his excitement turning to frustration, accused me of making it all up. But then suddenly he froze, staring at something behind me. I turned around, and there he was. The man with the cigarette standing right behind us, eyes fixed on the door of apartment number 12. He reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper, which he extended toward me. Hesitantly, I took it from his hand. Without a word, he turned and walked away. I stood there stunned, the paper clutched in my hand. Jerry, impatient and curious, grabbed the note from me and started reading. It was handwritten, the letters uneven and hurried, as if the writer had been trembling. The note read, "Rules of apartment. Number 12. Before you decide to explore, think twice. Rule 1. You can only enter the apartment between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. This is the only known way to gain access. Rule 2. When the clock strikes 3 a.m., you have 5 minutes to leave the apartment. If you don't, the door will be replaced by a concrete wall trapping you inside. If this happens, follow Rule 3. Rule 3. If trapped, your chances of survival are slim. You will hear wailing from the bedroom, growing louder by the second. Hide and pray you're not found. You can only leave the apartment again at 11 p.m. Rule 4. Between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., you can move freely within the apartment. However, if you enter any room, close the door behind you when you leave. Do not re-enter that room. Ignoring this rule will result in hearing a faint wail, and the apartment's exit door will begin to close. Run to the exit as fast as you can. Rule 5. In 1967, a woman named Isabella was brutally murdered in the bedroom. Her body was mutilated. If you hear a quiet wail, know that it's Isabella. Don't look at her or turn around. She hates being watched. Rule 6. Don't scream. It will only make your death quicker. Rule 7. Never turn on any light-emitting objects between 11:59 p.m. and 3 a.m. She is drawn to light. After reading the rules, Jerry was visibly excited. His eyes gleamed with adrenaline. "We have to go there," he said, a determined look on his face. We decided to go to the apartment at 11 p.m. We told our parents we were spending the night at Ben's place on the second floor to study for a math exam. They didn't mind. As the clock struck 10:55 p.m., we slipped out of Ben's apartment. But Ben, awakened by our movements, asked where we were going. We told him about apartment number 12 and the note. Skeptical at first, Ben eventually agreed to come along. "I don't believe you, but let's check it out," he said, clearly intrigued. "I'm going with you." Jerry nodded in agreement. The darkness of the night enveloped us, and excitement and tension grew with every step that brought us closer to apartment number 12. As we stood in front of the apartment, we made sure the corridor was empty. Then Jerry reached for the door handle. The door opened with a quiet creak, and we held our breath, ready to see what we remembered. A solid concrete wall that seemed to be the end of our journey. But as the door opened fully, we stood in shock. Instead of the cold, concrete wall that we both so clearly remembered, we saw an ordinary room. The room was dark but fully accessible, as if there had never been any obstacle there. This is impossible," Ben whispered, his confidence dissolving into the air. I stepped closer, hardly believing my own eyes. Jerry stood beside me, just as confused as I was, his hand still resting on the handle. Finally, we snapped out of it and entered the apartment, closing the door behind us. All three of us took out our flashlights after entering the apartment. The first thing that caught our eye after turning them on was the damage. The walls were covered with a thick layer of mold, its dark stains spreading along the rotten surfaces. In some places, the plaster had completely fallen off, revealing the raw brick underneath, and some areas were literally eaten away by moisture. For a moment, I thought I could smell the sickly sweet odor of rotting wood and fungus, which made me nauseous. The windows, barely visible through the semi-darkness, were completely bricked up from the outside. The curtains, which might have once been decorative, were now just shreds, dirty, decayed, and so fragile they could disintegrate at the slightest touch. The furniture in the room was scattered haphazardly. Old armchairs and sofas were caked with dirt, their upholstery consumed by moisture. Trash and shards of glass, which might have once been part of windows or mirrors, were strewn across the floor. Sinister moisture stains hung from the ceiling. In one corner, I noticed the remains of an old broken chandelier, hanging miserably from a single creaking chain. Every breath was a struggle. The air in the apartment was heavy, filled with dust and dampness. Yet in all this decay, one thing was most unsettling: the feeling that, despite looking abandoned for decades, the apartment had something in it that made me feel watched. We hesitantly explored what was once a living space until, finally, as we approached the door leading to the bedroom, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Jerry looked at me, his face pale and his eyes filled with fear. I felt that something terrible awaited us behind those doors, something we could not even begin to imagine. The smell of rotting meat hung in the air, making me feel sick and only intensifying the sense of unease. The door creaked open, and we stood in the doorway. What we saw exceeded our worst nightmares. The bedroom looked like a scene from a macabre film. The walls were covered in bizarre, chaotic drawings made with blood and something that resembled dried shreds of flesh. In the middle of the room stood an old decayed bed, its mattress torn and soaked with blood, which had dried over time, forming dark, sticky stains. On the bed lay something we initially took for old, tattered rags. Only after a moment did we realize it was a person. The body was in a state of decomposition, barely holding together. It was scarred, and in some places, its limbs were cut off. Its eyes, empty and lifeless, seemed to be staring straight at us. Then I realized who I was looking at. I was looking at Isabella. I ran out of the room as fast as I could. The sight of the decaying body made my heart pound wildly, and my stomach churned. I felt an uncontrollable shiver run through my entire body. Jerry reacted second. He turned abruptly and, almost losing his balance, ran out of the bedroom. His breathing was ragged, his eyes wide with fear. Before we reached the front door, I felt I could no longer hold back my nausea. I stopped, doubled over, and vomited onto the floor. My body trembled. I also noticed that, for some inexplicable reason, the apartment door was open. Moments later, Ben ran out of the bedroom, asking what the hell that was. I didn't listen because I realized something that froze the blood in my veins. Ben hadn't closed the bedroom door behind him. Then I heard it, a faint, almost inaudible wail coming from inside the bedroom. The sound was like a moan, slow, full of suffering. Jerry and Ben lifted their heads and looked toward the open bedroom door. I wanted to do the same, but I remembered the rules. The fifth rule. At the same moment, my friends turned their gaze toward the bed. The wailing grew louder, turning into a cry of despair, and I felt pure survival instinct take over. I didn't wait a second longer. I ignored everything. I didn't care what Jerry and Ben were doing, or even if they were running after me. I thought of only one thing: run. I sprang to my feet, leaping over broken furniture and piles of trash. I ran blindly, barely noticing what was in front of me. My heart pounded like a hammer, and my head throbbed with adrenaline. Every step, every stumble in this abandoned, rotten apartment only spurred me to even greater effort. Suddenly, I noticed the door leading to the corridor slowly starting to close. My heart stopped. I knew that if those doors slammed shut, we would be trapped in this cursed apartment, and the hope of escape might disappear forever. Jerry ran beside me, his breathing heavy, his movements full of panic. My heart beat in quick, almost terrifying coordination. Just as the door slammed shut with a loud bang, Jerry and I were already in the corridor. We tumbled out of the apartment, falling to the ground, trying to catch our breath. With a mixture of terror and relief, I looked at Jerry. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, a cold shiver ran through me as I realized that Ben was still inside. I suddenly collapsed, struggling to stand, but my legs would no longer obey me. I fainted, collapsing onto the cold, dirty corridor floor. I swear, in the moment I fell, I saw him. A man with a cigarette stood at the end of the corridor, smiling at me mockingly. After those events, we decided to remain silent. It was a decision that came hard to us, but we considered it the only possible one. Ben's disappearance was reported, but he was never found. He vanished without a trace, but I still remember. I remember the mocking smile of the man with the cigarette and that awful moan that haunts me in my nightmares to this day. And though years have passed, I still can't forget what happened to Ben, and I still feel the weight of the fact that he was never found. After Jerry and I finished school, our paths diverged, and I never saw my friend again until that evening. Do you remember that horrible evening? That night changed our entire lives, especially mine when I looked into the bedroom that night, and I saw that. "What did you see?" I asked, worried. I saw Isabella. Her corpse slowly stood up on what used to be legs, and she let out that moan. I saw her grab Ben by the ankles and slowly drag him into the bedroom. I heard his screams and then the sound of bones breaking. I know that your nightmare probably ended that day, but mine only began. Since then, I hear her at night. I hear her whispers, and they're accompanied by the smell of rotting meat. I was probably the only person who didn't think he was crazy. I was there with him. I saw all those things and I heard that awful moan. In 5 minutes, it'll be 11 p.m. I'm going to that apartment. I can't take it anymore. I have to end this. It dawned on me that I was most likely seeing Jerry for the last time. I watched as he slowly got up from the table and left the apartment. In the end, the story of apartment number 12 remains an unsolved mystery. The strange rules, Isabella's wailing, and Jerry's disappearance have left an indelible mark on Harry's psyche. Perhaps these events were just the result of an overactive imagination, or maybe they were signs of a truly malevolent force. Whatever the case, this story serves as a warning that there are things we should not delve too deeply into. If you found this story intriguing, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more spine-chilling tales. Share your thoughts about apartment number 12 in the comments. Would you dare to step inside? There are places that exist beyond the boundaries of reality. Strange, forgotten spaces where time seems to stand still, and fear becomes a silent companion. Among such places are abandoned restaurants, offices, or subway stations, long neglected and forsaken by the world. It's in these places where cracks in reality begin to appear, allowing bizarre entities to infiltrate our world. This is the story of someone who dedicated their life to working for an international organization that handles these eerie liminal spaces where reality and illusion intertwine. The tale begins at an abandoned McDonald's in the deep outback of Australia, where nothing is quite as it seems. There are places that exist outside the boundaries of our reality, strange dimensions governed by beings beyond human comprehension. Think of them as threads interwoven with our reality, sometimes piercing through and seeping into our world. You might have heard of liminal spaces, those eerie, transitional places suspended in time, hauntingly empty and inducing a deep sense of dread. Imagine schools at night, long winding hallways, or deserted indoor playgrounds with dim lighting. These liminal spaces often become sites where reality tears, allowing otherworldly dimensions to slip in. At first, these changes are subtle, almost imperceptible, until these places transform into something else entirely. I work for an international organization that monitors and, when necessary, seals these rifts in reality. Our main targets are abandoned locations that receive no human interaction or conscious thought, like deserted office buildings or disused underground stations. These forgotten, isolated places are particularly vulnerable to the influence of other dimensions, allowing extraneous beings to manifest. Among the various departments in our company, I belong to the on-site containment team, where we serve as the final line of defense against identified high-risk anomalies. I've spent most of my life in this role and recently retired. Throughout my career, I've witnessed things ranging from the terrifying to the downright bizarre, and it has taken a toll on me. I'm sharing my experiences now, partly as a record of my time in the field, and partly to unburden myself from the weight of these memories. As fitting, I'll begin with my very first encounter. The abandoned McDonald's in the heart of the Australian outback. I stared out the car window as the rust-red desert landscape slid past, occasionally broken by the low, scrubby bushes. My partner, Dan, gripped the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the roadside for our target. Standard protocol dictated that missions involve 2 agents, one of whom should be more experienced if the other was newer. You might wonder why we don't send larger teams to handle these situations more effectively, but doing so increases the risk of disturbing and destabilizing the anomaly. 2 agents have proven to be the optimal number, with most operations succeeding, provided no one makes a significant mistake. Dan was several years my senior and wasn't much of a talker, so the long 3-hour drive had been spent mostly in uncomfortable silence. I tried turning on the radio about 30 minutes in, but he promptly swatted my hand away, insisting we needed to stay alert. The man was on edge even though we were still miles from the actual site. Finally, we arrived at our destination, an old abandoned McDonald's that had last been operational in the 1960s when this road was the main route to a now-forgotten tourist town. Dan parked the car on the roadside, not even pulling into the parking lot. It was a cautious move, one I wouldn't have thought of as a rookie on my first mission. As was routine, Dan stepped out first, surveying the area before signaling me to grab the backpacks and follow him to the building. The backpacks, courtesy of LimSec, were packed with standard military survival gear and specialized items needed to operate in liminal spaces and alternate dimensions. The air outside was scorching and dry, like stepping into an oven. As I exited the car, the sun's heat intensified, making my skin feel like it was being seared. Dan had already crossed into the parking lot and was now scrutinizing the building as if expecting it to explode at any moment. When I caught up, he pointed out the oddities of the site. The first was obvious and sent a chill down my spine. The fluorescent lights inside the building were flickering. Keep in mind, this place had been disconnected from the power grid over 50 years ago. Just that fact alone was enough to quicken my pulse. The other anomalies were subtler. The parking lot spaces seemed too narrow. The trash bin at the entrance was overflowing, and the exterior was strangely pristine. At first glance, you wouldn't guess this restaurant had been abandoned for decades. "Let's get this done quickly. I've got a bad feeling," Dan murmured, leading the way to the glass doors. He pushed them open, letting me enter before placing a doorstop to prevent the door from closing behind us. You might expect the door to creak or the furniture inside to be covered in dust, but that wasn't the case. The interior looked like a standard McDonald's, complete with red chairs and thin wooden tables. But as I looked closer, more oddities became apparent. The two drinks sitting on a table in a corner, straws pointed towards the chairs as if a couple had just been there. A pile of crumpled napkins arranged in a crude pyramid on another table, with a small Ronald McDonald figurine staring straight at me. Dan had already pulled out an anomaly detector, which measured disturbances in particles and energy, like a radiation detector, but for reality glitches. The device beeped steadily, confirming we were in the right place, not that it wasn't already obvious. Our objective was to locate the center of the anomaly, the 0 point where the disturbance originated, and seal it using our equipment. The process is usually straightforward, provided the space isn't too disturbed. As we cautiously explored the area, eyes glued to the detector for any spikes, I started to hear a low humming sound coming from behind the counter, somewhere in the kitchen. I alerted Dan, who heard it too, so we moved towards the kitchen. I gasped when I saw the source of the sound. On the counter sat an old CRT TV, flickering with static. Beyond the TV, the kitchen seamlessly transitioned into what looked like an open-plan office, complete with cubicles and computers. As we approached the TV, the anomaly detector's beeping intensified. The transition from kitchen to office was sharp, as if someone had sliced out a section of an office and dropped it here. The tiles suddenly gave way to blue carpet, but where the materials met, there was a slight fuzziness, something my eyes couldn't quite focus on. Dan stopped me just as I was about to step over the transition into the office space, gripping my shoulder firmly. "No need to go there. This TV is the source," he whispered, setting his backpack on the counter and pulling out a pair of wire cutters. With them, he snipped the cable leading from the TV to the wall. As expected, the TV immediately shut off, plunging us into an eerie silence. A heavy, oppressive feeling settled over us, and I couldn't shake the instinctual sense that cutting the cord had been a mistake. Dan seemed to feel the same, though he kept his composure, sticking to protocol and attaching our devices to the TV to neutralize it. "2 more minutes and we'll be done," he said, securing a device to the TV that looked suspiciously like a bomb. I couldn't tell you how the technology worked. I still don't understand the science behind these anomalies or spaces. Everything was going smoothly until the humming started up again, louder and more intense than before, and this time, it wasn't coming from the TV. Dan spun around trying to locate the source of the sound, but it seemed to be emanating from all around us. My stomach dropped as adrenaline surged through my veins. The sound drew nearer, closing in on us, and then, from behind the counter, it rose. The creature was a humanoid shape made entirely of static, a kaleidoscope of sizzling black and white patterns. Its edges were indistinct, and its movements made it appear to glide through the air. Heart pounding, Dan grabbed my arm and shouted, "Move!" With nowhere else to go, we bolted into the office space, weaving through the cubicles to hide from the entity. We were armed, but our weapons were almost useless against something like this, like trying to fend off a T-Rex with a pistol. "You go left, I'll go right. Keep your radio on," Dan yelled. I nodded and veered left. The open office space seemed to stretch on forever, the cubicle layout forming a nonsensical maze. Each cubicle was identical: a black monitor, a keyboard, and a mouse. The keyboards, I noticed, had no labels on the keys, and there were no personal items or chairs. As I walked, the carpet made a wet, smacking sound underfoot, and I realized I could no longer hear the entity's static buzz. I slowed to a stop, surrounded by the endless cubicles. The feeling of isolation gnawed at me, and I glanced around as the overhead lights flickered. The air smelled faintly of ash and damp earth. I suspected Dan had distracted the entity from me, leading it away. Both were still somewhere in this place. I pulled out my radio, a small, discreet black unit with a special receiver and transmitter, and switched it on. "Dan, do you copy?" I called into the radio. I clipped the radio to my belt, trying to figure out how to navigate my way out of this place. I still had my own Limsec backpack, so I wasn't entirely helpless. But the issue with being this deep into an anomaly is that it shifts and morphs around you, making navigation nearly impossible. Still, I had a detector similar to Dan's that would guide me to an exit point. If I was lucky, it would be back at the McDonald's where we entered, or it could be on the other side of the world. But that was another problem. I wandered aimlessly until I noticed something: the wall of darkness. It loomed in the distance, surrounding me entirely. It was like being inside a video game with the render distance set to its lowest setting, and as I cautiously moved towards the black void, I couldn't help but feel it was alive, sentient. Every step brought me closer to the void, which now seemed to pulse and quiver in response to my approach. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the void. A man, tall and skeletal, his skin pale and his eyes empty, voids of black. He wore a suit that seemed to blend into the darkness behind him. "Welcome to my domain," he whispered in a voice that reverberated inside my skull. I tried to back away, but I found I was rooted in place, held by some unseen force. The figure tilted his head, observing me with an unnerving curiosity. "You shouldn't be here," he continued, and I felt my heart freeze in my chest. Before I could react, the void surged forward, engulfing me in darkness. I woke up on the floor of the McDonald's, staring up at the flickering fluorescent lights. My head throbbed with pain, and I could taste blood in my mouth. I pushed myself up, wincing as I surveyed the surroundings. The office space had vanished. I was back in the restaurant. Dan was nowhere to be seen. I stumbled towards the counter where the TV had been, but all that remained was a blackened patch on the floor. Shaking, I grabbed my radio and tried to contact Dan again, but there was no response. All I could hear was static, and that sound sent waves of nausea through me. I made my way outside, and as soon as I stepped out, the oppressive heat hit me like a wall. The sun was still high in the sky, and it was as if no time had passed. I didn't look back. I walked straight to the car, threw my backpack in the trunk, and drove away. Dan was never found. He was listed as missing in action, and that was that. There was no further investigation, no attempt to locate his body. The place was marked off limits, and as far as I know, the anomaly was never resolved. They didn't even bother to seal it. Years have passed since then, but I still can't shake the feeling that Dan is out there, somewhere in that twisted reality, trapped in a never-ending loop. These stories are rare, and though they haunt me, they're nothing compared to the dangers that lurk in those places. I'm sharing this now as a reminder that some things are better left forgotten, that there are places we should never go. After many years in this line of work, the protagonist finally dares to share the story that first led him into the world of liminal spaces. Even after all these years, the memory of that abandoned McDonald's still lingers in his mind, especially the mystery surrounding his teammate who vanished without a trace. Perhaps in some other space and time, Dan is still wandering in an alternate reality, never to find his way back. This serves as a reminder to all of us about the mysteries out there that we should never explore. If you ever come across a place that feels cold and alien, as if it doesn't belong to this world, it's probably best to keep your distance. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments, and if you want to hear more spine-chilling tales, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next video.